We're going to talk about the Waterside Workers Federation. Now, this was a much more difficult task than I thought. Much more difficult because there's a lot of elements to it. It wasn't really until the beginning of World War II that we had a real Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. But historically, the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia was formed in 1902. It was registered in 1907. It was dissolved in 1993 when they amalgamated with the Seamen's Union to form the Maritime Union of Australia. And the history of the wharfs is basically a history of technological innovation. Now, the first record I can find, and most likely will be others, of a group of people directly involved in wharf work forming a union is the Labouring Men's Union of Circular Quay, which was formed in 1874. You've got to remember in these days that wharf workers were critical as far as Australia was concerned because there were no planes and the only way to get goods here and exports were through the wharves. So who controlled the wharves had an exceptional amount of power over the government of the day. Now, most of the unions that were formed were local unions. And although the Waterside Workers Federation was formed in 1902, most of the unions were local. And they were split into different components. They were split into different components, depending on the type of work people did. For example, in Sydney, as I said, you had the Labouring Workers Union of Circular Quay, which involved wharf workers. You had the Western Sydney Labourers Workers Association, which involved wharf workers, which was formed in the early 1880s. Both groups amalgamated in 1984. Now, we had the same issues. We had the same issues in every state. Remember, we didn't have a Federation of Australia until 1901. One of the most interesting unions, the first union for unskilled workers in West Australia, was the Fremantle Lumpers Union. Remember that word, lumpers. Fremantle Lumpers Union, Lumpers. Also, at the same time, we had, a little bit later, we had the Sydney, Sydney Coal Miners Lumpers Union. So across the country, we had these small local unions, which basically looked after the interests of small localities. There was no overriding union on the walls. Now, in many ways, there was no need for an overriding union on the walls because in the early 1900s, after Federation and the Labor government took power, one of their central policies which they passed legislation for was to give preference to unionised workers on the job site. So by the 1910s, unionised workers had preference. Therefore, the local unions continued to survive. And although the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia was formed in 1902, most of the local unions didn't federate. There was no need to federate because they had first preference because they were unionists. They had first preference as far as jobs were concerned. Now, interestingly, the first secretary of the Sydney Miners Lumpers Union, or Sydney Coal Miners Lumpers Union, was Billy Hughes, although he wasn't a worker. And the first Secretary General of the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia in 1902 was Billy Hughes. Which is fascinating, but we'll just leave that there for a minute. So we have all these little local unions fighting their little battles. Things changed with World War I because the War Precautions Act of 1917 removed the right of preferential treatment for unionists. Because what they were trying to do is create a very, how shall I put it, a tame war thing. Because remember, in the midst of the conscription struggle, the Labor Party is split. 2/3 remained Labor, 1/3 joined the Nationals and formed a new government under Billy Hughes, that name again, right? So the War Precautions Act stripped away the opportunity for local unions to be employed. Now remember, in those days, people were not employed in the wars on a permanent basis. They had what's called the bull system. What that meant is the foreman would come out and say, you, and you will be working today. There'd be pick-up points. So in West Australia in 1919, we saw a blow-up because in West Australia, when the War Precautions Act was introduced in 1917, a bodgy union was set up, which was called the National Wharf Union of Australia. And if you're a scab, you join the National Wharf Union of Australia. So what happened is the Fremantle Lumpers Union members lost their ability to be employed. And because it was part-time work, it wasn't permanent, there was no holiday pay, no sick pay, there was nothing except you got paid for the work you did. What we saw was a blow-up in Fremantle. And it occurred in 1919 when the Fremantle Lumpers Union was trying to regain control of the wharves. Now, those of you who've got a memory long enough will remember that the 1919 was the height of the influenza epidemic in Australia, which killed more Australians than died in World War I, which was 62,000. And people understood that you needed quarantine. Quarantine was something that people understood in those days. Because when a ship came, if somebody was sick, they were quarantined. As we know, there was a quarantine station down in Queensland, right? So they understood quarantine. Now, the SS Dimboola was under quarantine for a number of weeks. The government of the day wanted to increase exports, basically, of wool. But the Fremantle Lumpers Union refused to service the SS Dimboola. So the government under Premier Colback gave preference to scabs. Right? And so that because work was hard to come by, and because the foreman basically picked the workers, we got to a situation where over a number of months, hardly anybody from the Fremantle Lumpers Union was working. And they had a great deal of sympathy, because in those days, pre-mechanisation, there was a great deal of sympathy for them in Fremantle and Perth. For a number of public meetings, for a number of demonstrations, and matters came to a head in May 1919, when the Premier was going to try to break the domination the domination of the wars by the Fremantle Lumpers Union, which had taken over the wharves and were not unloading ships. So what happened is that the Premier called on these volunteers to come with him on a boat, a large ship, to go to the walls to unload the SS Nimbula, which was under quarantine. And what happened was there was a wholesale riot. Police with fixed bayonets were used to try to break up the rioters. Now the Fremantle Lumpers Union had taken over a bridge which was over the entrance to the port. So when the Premier Colback and his mob arrived, they threw bricks and stones and you name it and forced them back. At the same time, the police were ordered to charge into the crowd. We're talking about thousands of men. Many returned service. Things got out of hand when they saw one of their own, Mr. Brown, his name was, being bayoneted in the thigh by the police. What happened then was that Renton, who was the president of the Fremantle Lumpers Union, was sit over there for battle, and a young man in his 30s, Mr. Ross Edwards, came to his assistance, and he was hit in the head with a baton. He was a father of 3 children, young children, and he sustained a skull fracture and died 5 days later. So this was a big, we'll talk about what happened in Melbourne in 28, but this was a big issue. It really mobilised unionists across West Australia. And the government was forced to back down because the police were not willing to fire into the crowd. So the government backed down, and the woman and his wife and 3 children were paid reasonable compensation for his death. What happened is, as a result of the strike, as a result of the riot, the National Wharf Labourers Union members were driven off the docks, and the Fremantle Lumpers Union regained control of the docks. But remember, this is part-time work. People are picked every day. If you get under the foreman's skin, you don't get picked. People rely on this work, for their families to survive. Because there's really no social security benefits of any type of time. Now let's switch to you. I want to switch to Sydney and talk about how difficult the work was. We have no idea how difficult work was. Now, the beginning of the 20th century was the steam revolution. What we saw, ships change from sailing ships to steam. To create steam, you need coal. How do you get coal into a ship? Right? So we had what we call the most highly paid wharf workers. But they didn't describe themselves as wharf labourers. They thought they were a cut above wharf labourers. They were the Lumpers, Coal Miners Workers Union. And I'll give you an idea of the word. Say 1902, right? You had a ship full of coal with steam up next to a steamer that needed coal to be put in the hole. Right? What would happen is that the members of the union were divided into 4 sections. There were 5 subsections, sorry. There were the shovelers, the winchmen, the planksters, the carriers, and the trimmers. And they all had a specific task to do. Now, Australia was backwards in terms of introducing technological innovation to the world until the containerisation occurred in the 1960s. So what would you have? You'd have these large wicker baskets which would be lowered into the hull of the ship with the coal. The shovelers would shovel the coal into the wicker baskets, and the wicker basket would hold about 200 pounds. About 200 pounds of coal. Then the winchmen would winch the wicker basket out of the hole and place it on the shoulder of the plankster. Now, the plankster's job was to run down this 9 feet plank, a 3 metre plank, with this, it was only 16 inches wide, run across the plank to the other side where the coal, the wicker basket, would be transferred by hand to the shoulder of the carrier. The carrier would then take that coal another short distance and offload it into the hold of the steamship. Then a few hours later, the trimmers would come and they would even out the coal, because if the coal's like this, the ship's going to capsize. So it's a labour-intensive work. It's dirty work. People fall, they get killed. People get injured. There's a lot of it's heat, it's hot work. I mean, the trimmers used to work in their loincloths, they'd say, and boots. It was so hot. You go in the hold of the ship. You get all the dust. You get silicosis. You get asbestosis. You get all these issues. So they were paid a little bit better. So this is what I'm trying to do is talk about the state of what the union movement looked like and how hard the work was. Now, there were lumpers unions in every port. They're the ones who lump the cargo from the ship off to the shore. That's what they call lumpers. That's why it's a lumpers union. So, what we see is that this system continued to a significant degree until the 1920s. Now, these unions, although they weren't federated, most of them were not federated to the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. Most of these unions continued to chug along under the old system, the bull system, the pick-up system, where you go to a pick-up point, you'd be picked by the foreman, you do your work, 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, you get paid for it, and turn up the next day, if you want work. But at this stage, most people work because the National Workers Union had been collapsed with the riots and freedom. So by the late 1920s, we had a situation where the War Precautions Act was no longer in place. We had a very conservative government headed by Stanley Bruce, who has the honour of being the only Prime Minister apart from John Howard to lose his seat in the general election. He was the member for Flinders, a businessman. He decided, like John Howard decided, when he introduced work choices, he decided that we needed to break the whole all these little unions had on the wall. So what happened was that there was a new act which was passed. It was called the Transport Workers Act, which was passed in 1928. Now this was a federal act. So what happened is all wharf workers, whether they were lumpers, whether they were part of the wharf union, had to be registered. They had to pay a registration fee and be registered. The unions at that particular point in time, there was a Melbourne Wharf Workers Union. They described this as having a dog collar, but they didn't have the power to resist it. And what the government did is, like Uber, they actually put out 10,000 licences in Melbourne. You only needed 5,000 people to operate the ships. So if you've got 10,000 licences, it means you can get scabs who are non-unionised. You get non-unionised workers to unload the ships. Because when the foreman would go around, there's the bull system where they pick and choose. They're not going to pick workers that are unionised and the members of unions. because they formed a new union in 28 called the Permanent and Casual Wharf Workers Union. So, in order to try to stop the domination of their work, the unionist work, that's the lumpers and the wharf workers, by the Permanent and Casual Waterside Workers Union, what they did is they held a general strike, and it was a militant strike, not just a strike, but it was their job to drive the scabs off the piers. Now, at that particular point in time, if you think the media today is biased, have a look at the reports from 1928. What eventually happened is there was a confrontation between members of the Permanent and Casual Wharf Workers Union and the Melbourne Wharf Workers Union. And what occurred, and also members of the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia, and what occurred was basically a police riot, where the police shot into a crowd of unionists who were based on the wharf in Princess Pier, just down the road, on the 2nd of November 2028. 3 were injured. Alan Whittaker, who was a returned serviceman, injured on the first day in the invasion of Gallipoli in 1915, 25th of April. Lived with his mum, Farland, and his brother Percy. The other brother Cecil, who had also volunteered for the war, had died on the Western Front. He was shot in the face, and he died on the 29th of January 1929. Now, interestingly, when they did an inquest into the death of Ross Edwards in Fremantle in 1990, the finding was accidental death by an unknown person. Police officer was never charged. When they did an inquest in Melbourne, although Whittaker had been shot in the face and died because of his wounds, and these men didn't have guns, right? The wharf workers. It was described as justifiable homicide. The police did what they had to do because they were in fear of their lives and the lives of the scabs. Okay? So 1928 was a critical year in Melbourne. Now, those of you interested in history, on the 2nd of November every year, down at Princess Pier, I think at around 11 a.m, there is a small gathering to mark the death of Alan Whittaker and that moment. His brother Percy survived till 1980. Now, at that particular point in time, there was a lot of things going on because at the beginning of the Depression, most of the members of the Waterside Workers Federation and the Wharf Miners Union lived in Port Melbourne. When Alan Whittaker's body was examined by the coroner, not only did the coroner say that he had been shot in the face and died because of his head injuries, but he was also suffering from malnutrition. So you've got to understand that around Port Melbourne, South Melbourne, most of the were in 1928, that malnutrition, a lack of food, evictions, police brutality were part of everyday life. So the workers that have lost the ability to work on the wharves were basically facing starvation. So what we saw was pitched battles between members of the Permanent and Casual Waterside Workers Union and the Waterside Workers Federation. People were disfigured, they were killed in these battles. They were thrown over bridges. It's quite nasty. At the same time, 3 members of the Waterside Workers Federation in Australia, Sandy McIver, a bloke called O'Connor, and a bloke called Delaney, were involved in, were convicted of being involved in a series of bombings which occurred in Melbourne during the height of this dispute. And they bombed a boarding house near Flagstaff. Well, it's alleged they bombed a boarding house near Flagstaff Gardens, the house of a ship owner in Conalong Road in Caulfield, and the Greek Club in the city. Why the Greek Club? Because scabs used to go upstairs to have their play cards, whatever. So this was a really life and death dispute. critical. You had children who were starving, you had malnourished men and women, you had people who weren't eligible for SUSA because they didn't exist in 28, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, although Stanley Bruce lost the election and lost his seat, and a Labor Party was elected, the depression occurred a few months later, and what we found is that the permanent and casual wharf workers union controlled the docks in Melbourne. The Waterside Workers Union, Waterside Workers Federation of Australia, which had over 2,500 members, was reduced to about 200 members. Now, over the next 10 years, we saw a revival in the fortunes of unionised workers, a slow revival. And we had the ludicrous situation in Melbourne North, I love this. They had a pick-up point where they had 4 different sections. There was a pick-up section in the same building for the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. There was a pick-up section for the Permanent and Casual Workers Union of Australia. There was a pick-up section, what they call first preferences and second preferences. These were people in neither organisation, so there was excess labour needed that had been picked up. And again, it was the same system. What was described as the bull system, which meant the foreman decided who worked for us. What was interesting about the Transport Workers Act of 1928 was, if you were fired and the foreman had power to fire you for any infraction, you could not reapply for registration for 6 months. So many wharf workers were driven off the wharves looking for another work. With the depression around the corner, it wasn't a good time. Now, so what happened? How did they get resuscitated? Well, I'm going to use the name which most of you will be familiar with, Big Jim Healy. Now, Big Jim Healy came across here, I think, from Middlesex, worked on the wharves in Mackay, was initially a member of the Labor Party, and in 1934 joined the Communist Party. Then, in 1937, he was elected Secretary General of the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. And the first thing they did was have what was described as the All Ports Conference. What they try to do is get all the disparate little unions which were involved, some of them have been around for 100 years, which represented workers in a disorganised way to federate with the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. I mean, their campaign was largely successful, except in Melbourne. Now, the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia in Melbourne believed that the executive in Sydney was illegitimate. And they believed that because the executive realised the only way they could control the wars was if everybody was in the same union. So there were these established permanent casual workers unions around ports around the country, which were basically scab unions. So what they proposed, the executive proposed that these scab unions be incorporated into the Waterside Workers Federation, and they would offer them membership. Now, all the branches around Australia agreed except for Melbourne, which had these bitter memories of 1928 strikes. There was no way they were going to allow scabs in their division. This is a federation, so the different unions are able to exercise power at a local level. And because of the hatred that had been dealt out of that past decade, what we saw was huge resistance to incorporate these destroyers as the No.2 branch of the Union, which was the SCAB unit, into the Melbourne branch of the Waterside Workers' Federation. Then came the glory days for the Union. World War II. Men were conscripted. There was a labour shortage. They needed men to unload ships. But before that, let's talk about what actually happened in 1938. In 1938, the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia made an in-principle decision to try to stop iron ore exports to Japan. And the Port Kembla workers, members of the number of years, were the only ones who refused to load iron ore onto these ships. Now, this was a major port, and 4,000 of them were fired by BHP a week before Christmas 1938. They eventually won that struggle, and iron ore exports to Japan were ceased by the end of 1938. So, I mean, that's an important thing to remember. That's where Bob Menzies, who was the Attorney General, got the name Pig Iron Bob, you know, because they were selling iron ore and even allowed.
But they were going to return it, right?
No. Yeah, but not in the way you think. Not only were they selling iron ore to Japanese, they allowed a Japanese company, which was managed by the Japanese Imperial Forces, to mine iron ore in Western Australia. So let's get back to 1940s. So in the 1940s, where there's a labour shortage, the Labor government has to negotiate with the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia, because they control all the ports except Melbourne, which is controlled by an affiliate, but an affiliate which doesn't follow executive decisions. They're always against it. And because of the militant tradition and all the harm that occurred, you found that much of the rank and file continued to support old unionists. And the healing mob, they had a name for them, they were called scab herders. Scab herders. So they used to herd scab workers into the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia. So scab herders. So during World War II, the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia became stronger and stronger because of its pivotal role in the war effort. They made agreements with the federal government in terms of permanency of the war, trying to break down the bull system, but that didn't occur in Melbourne. After World War II, I think I'll just digress here because this is one of the most important political decisions made by a union. After World War II, the Dutch wanted to retake their colony in Indonesia because for the last 500 years it had been a very, very successful colony. It was the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia, minus the Melbourne branch, which introduced bans on ships that were carrying munitions and money to go to Java. So we had this hold up here around the country of ships. Interestingly, in Melbourne there was a ship called the Cariza, which was a Dutch ship, it was full of money and munitions to go to Java to try to keep the old colonial forces into power. Now, although the local branch was against stopping them leaving the port, the rank and file broke ranks with the local branch and they introduced some bans on this particular ship. So the Indonesian crew left the ship. So the ship owners, and this is incredible when you think about it, the ship owners actually had a force of Indonesian troops stationed in Middle Harthill in Melbourne. And they were brought across to man the ships. They refused to man the ships and they were sent to jail in Pentridge and Geelong because that was mutiny. Then they called on an Indian crew. They got an Indian crew to man the ship. And again, it wasn't the port workers this time, it was the tugboat operators who refused to tug the Teresa out. So the next 4 years, the Waterside Workers' Federation was at the forehead of the struggle against the Dutch reclaiming Indonesia. I think this is something people forget when they talk about the Indonesian independence movement, how critical their interference in trade with Indonesia was. But getting back to Mr. Jim Healy. Now, Mr. Jim Healy realised that something had to give on the Melbourne Wars because he kept getting re-elected as the Secretary General, and again he was a member of the Communist Party, not the Marxist-Leninist, which is the Maoist, but that was the So in 1955, that's 10 years after the war, after the local branch had been declared bankrupt, not only bankrupt, but members of the local branch here had been siphoning funds into their pockets, and some of them were actually jailed for financial misappropriation. They called a mass meeting of Waterside Workers' Federation members, because by 1955 the groupers, you may remember Santa Maria's, had formed an alliance with the Waterside Workers' Federation of Melbourne. They had formed an alliance with the executive. So things came to a head when they called a mass meeting on the wharves in 1955. 5,000 members turned up for this mass meeting about incorporating the No.2 branch, which was the only one left in Australia, the permanent and casual Waterside Workers Union, into the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. And the discussion went on for hours. There were gunshots heard during the discussion. I mean, this time, the 28th strike was still fresh in people's minds. Eventually, a vote was cast among the 5,000. And who do you think won, and by how many votes? It's not a fair question. The Waterside Workers Federation of Australia won by 13 votes.
In a pool of 5,000.
In a pool of 5,000. And then that's over 20 years, almost 30 years later after the war strike. And they only won because the permanent casual Waterside Workers Union had funds in their coffers because they had scrupulously looked after the funds, not like the old executive in the Waterside Federation. And they promised that nobody who was a member in 1928 was a member in 1955. So they were incorporated now into the Waterside Workers Federation. So it took Healy and the federal executive 25 years to bring all these small, disparate unions into one union, which made them exceptionally powerful. Because even in the 50s, air transport was non-existent as far as goods as are. The country relied on ships. So when the Menzies Liberal government was elected, we had this all-powerful battle between the Menzies government who wanted to, like Bruce did, he wanted to de-unionise the wars. That was their primary aim. So we had these, what you call shadow wars, because a number of the executives were members of the Communist Party, and because the Waterside Workers Federation had placed bans on some exports, under what was called the Overseas Trade Act, Healy was charged with being, disloyal. Then what they tried to do, as you know, your history is, they tried through legislation to outlaw the Communist Party because they believed, like the buffoon in Washington believes, you get rid of the leadership, you're going to destroy the union. They tried to get rid of the Communist Party, and passed legislation that made it illegal to be a communist. There's only one problem. They chose the person who was a communist, and you had to prove you weren't, which is an impossible situation. So the onus of proof had been turned around. Now, the legislation was passed. Everett who was the leader of the Labor Party, took the matter to the High Court. The High Court overturned on a 6-1 majority that they couldn't outlaw the Communist Party in Australia. Then Menzies took the issue to the people in a referendum. And the members of the Waterside Workers' Federation were quite smart. They didn't campaign against it being an anti-communist bill. They campaigned against it being an anti-militant bill. It was about trying to destroy militancy among trade unions across the country. And they narrowly won the election. So the Menzies-led Liberal Country Party in those days had to come to some arrangement with the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia. Now, Healy and the executive understood that technology on the wharves is moving forward. Containerisation was beginning in the late 50s and early 60s. And they understood that if they didn't come to some type of agreement with the employers, the ship owners, the wharf owners, and the government of the day, that they would soon find themselves out of work. So they made a number of compromises, but made some gains, like permanency was introduced into wharf work. Because after World War II, you still had a bull system, but instead of picking individuals, you would pick a gang of 6 to 8 men to work a particular boat. So they made a compromise for permanency, accident pay, workers' compensation, all these things. Now, Healy went in for a minor operation in 1961 and he died from a pulmonary arrest 2 days later in 1961. The interesting thing is, and this is where I'm going to stop this one, the interesting thing about the Waterside Workers' Federation in Australia is that although Healy was a communist, the Communist Party attempted to have a communist re-elected as Secretary General, but they lost the election to a Mr. Fitzgibbon, who was a member of the ANC. So all I can say is, if you look at the history of the wars, it's a history of technology, and it's the history of having unionists having preference on the wars in terms of economy is concerned. In the 1910s, they had permanency because unionists across Australia had first preference for jobs. That's why the trade union movement was so strong. If you're a member of a union, you had first preference for a job. That was government legislation. Could you imagine trying to put that legislation through Parliament in 2026? Unionists get first preference? The second thing is, because there was the unionists had first preference, there was a widespread number of unions which basically covered different type of workers on the wharves. And we spoke about that. Then in the War Precautions Act in 1917, unionists lost preference on the wharves. This led to a number of disputes and the creation of bodgy unions like the National Wharf Workers Union of Australia, the Permanent Casual Wharf Workers Union of Australia, which dominated the wharves for the next 10 to 15 years. Then with the election of the Jim Healy as Secretary General and him calling an all-ports conference to try to get all these small unions to federate into the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. We saw the growth of the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia. It was assisted by World War II and there was a labour shortage. Became involved in a number of political actions before World War I with the iron ore, before World War II with the iron ore, after World War II with Indonesian independence. And with the introduction of containerism, we saw the number of men that were never in the wars was drastically reduced. And that's been the history of wharf struggle. That's why the MUA was formed in 1993, where the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia joined the Seamen's Union, because both had minuscule membership, not because they didn't have coverage, but because you didn't need that number of workers. Then we saw in the last 2 years, we saw the Maritime Union of Australia join the CFMEU in order to survive. And now we're going to see the introduction of overhead cranes, which are actually, and we've seen them in ports around the country, which are actually run by computers and artificial intelligence. You don't even need that crane operator, which is almost the last person left on the wharves in terms of unloading and loading containers. So
I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to go off to catch the last train.
Oh,
Let's
sorry.
get back to Oakley easily.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for coming.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It'll be on the YouTube, so.
Yeah, yes, we are. Yeah.
All right, question. I know I've bored you, but the thing is, when you look at these people, I thought I'd go in 1902 to 1961, it'd be easy, but it wasn't. It was a very convoluted history, which was related to how unionists were held by the community at large. The 1928 strike, there was no sympathy for them amongst the people of Melbourne and Victoria. There was no sympathy. I mean, the newspapers basically called them, murderers. And the fact is, not one of the wharf workers involved in the 1928 strike was ever questioned or charged, because they knew that if they ended up in court, it would create a great deal of sympathy for the wharf workers that have lost their jobs. Questions? You don't have to.
So what year was the fight when there was 5,000 that had to...
That was 1955 when they did the vote.
55.
I mean, could you imagine 5,000 people in a big shed? Now, you've got to remember that these people were in the same shed. You had the Waterside Workers Federation of Australia in one shed, one part of the shed. You had the Permanent Casual Wharf Workers Union of Australia, another shed. And then you had two small, you had another shed with what was called second preference workers. There weren't enough in those, they go there. Then there were people out in the yard who were hoping for a job, who'd never got a job. So, and after a huge debate, gunshots being heard, people pulling guns, they only won by 13 votes to incorporate that union. That's how bitter that struggle was. Now, those gentlemen I mentioned who were charged with bombing, each of them received 15 years jail. Sandy MacGyver, who lived till 1980, he spent most time in jail, about 11 and a half years, because they used to say in Petridge, he was uncontrollable. So, so you can see it all. There's people being killed, people being maimed, people being, it was a huge, and it's understandable that the Wharf Workers Federation, their sons, because usually it was a family type of thing, that their sons would have remembered what they went through in 1928, how starvation was and evictions was a real issue. Today, you can't buy a decent house in Port Melbourne for less than $2 million. Now things have changed.
Yeah, I was going to say, during the 50s, that was Korea was happening.
Korea finished in 53.
Yeah. I don't think they weren't involved in anything with regard to Korea. But you've got to remember that returned servicemen were critical in the struggle during World War I, because it gave them some type of credibility. And when they had the Victory March in Fremantle in 1919, they had over 200 returned servicemen in uniform who were members of the Lumpers Union marching at the head of the victory, at the head of the funeral of Ross Edwards in their uniforms. So a very important element, both on the left and the right, because a lot of returned servicemen became part of the new guard. So you've got to remember that. So now next month I'm going to do a lecture presentation on World War I. I'm going to title it World War One, workers at either end of the boat.